In this series of 3 videos, we're going to look at the history of American food, sort of an overview of how the food's changed as America's changed. While still hunter-gatherers, the East Coast Indians, the Eastern Woodlands Indians, especially those in the South, did plant and eat a variety of vegetables. The staples were the so-called three sisters, beans, squash, and corn, which were always grown together, which helped replenish the soil. I don't think they understood how, the soil depletion, but they knew that if they grew together, you could grow these crops longer. Corn was particularly important, but it wasn't native to the East Coast Indians. It had been acquired through generations of trading with Native Americans to the Southwest. Native Americans on the East Coast relied on things like pumpkins, melons, and wild rice, among others. They gathered blueberries, strawberries, raspberries, and a variety of nuts. During the winter, they would get maple syrup from trees. The liquid was put in wooden troughs and stirred day and night over a fire. After a long time, the liquid syrup changed into a form of sugar. All East Coast Woodlands Native Americans were also excellent fishermen, using nets and harpoons and long canoes hollowed out by hand and with the use of fire. What they would do in the picture on the left here is they'd have a net across shallow water and they would drive the fish into the net. And you can see one of the Native Americans throwing the net to round up the fish there on the right. Fish and also shellfish were critical elements of the Native American diet. I've always thought that you had to be awfully hungry to eat the guy that ate the first oyster, but oysters were certainly part of the diet of the coastland Indians. Certainly the Native Americans along the East Coast woodlands were excellent hunters. Here you can see them disguised with carcasses of deer to get closer to shoot them with their bows and arrows. Venison was a staple of their diet, although other meat came from animals such as rabbits, beavers, and turkeys, among others. Men did the hunting and women tended the crops. Various stews were popular, although of course they didn't have the metal pan like you see here. Cooking methods included baking, frying, boiling, and roasting over an open fire. Further west from the East Coast Eastern Woodlands Indians, you had the Indians on the Great Plains, and their bison were critical to their life. They were nomadic people following the herds. Now they ate the bison, but they also ate game such as deer, wolves, coyotes, rabbits, and gophers, among others. In an environment of scarcity, the Great Plains Native Americans used all parts of the buffalo. They'd have the hide for clothing, bones for cooking, and other implements, and they'd eat the muscles and other internal organs for meat, things like the tongues and the intestines, and they eat all aspects of that buffalo. Buffalo meat was cut into strips and hung to dry. Then the meat was pounded into shreds with a stone, mixed with hot buffalo fat and berries, poured into a bag, and then left to cool and harden. Turnips were commonly eaten, as were a variety of berries gathered and cooked by the women. Overall, you might say the diet of the Great Plains Indians was more paleo-oriented. Further west still, the Anasazi Pueblo Indians faced even a tougher environment and consequently ate a less varied diet. They adapted well to the arid Southwest, and they made elaborate and impressive irrigation canals for scarce water, and they also built below-ground basements to beat the heat and preserve food. Because of the scarcity of the southwestern environment, the Pueblo Indians were famous for their decorated weaved baskets and painted baked clay jugs, obviously used to help store limited supplies of food and water. When the Europeans arrived, they brought their own crops and food traditions, and in the end, both Native American and European diets changed dramatically, the so-called Columbian Exchange. Cattle for beef, milk, and leather was an important import to North America, brought from Europe by the Spanish. Breeding programs and immigration grew their numbers, and soon there were many breeds and feral cattle as well. Europeans brought pigs to the Americas and bred them as well, providing food like pork chops and bacon. Pigs and hogs were resilient and often allowed to forage in the nearby woods for their own subsistence, ultimately rounded up for slaughter with the help of dogs. Eventually, however, this proved a problem. Once they became feral, they had no natural predators and they over-reproduced, and they would then return to the outlying farms and devastate the crops. When the English brought the honeybees to make honey, They too escaped and became feral. Native Americans would call the bees English flies and lament that when you saw a fly, white people would surely follow. Goats used for milk were brought to America as well. Other foods that were imported to the Americas included clockwise from left, coffee, olives, onions, peaches, pears, bananas, cotton, and sugarcane. Now, of course, other crops and animals were brought from America to Europe. One of the most important animals brought to Europe from America was the turkey. Also, pheasants were brought to Europe, which became a popular bird for game hunting among the wealthy. Besides tobacco, a major American plant that was brought to Europe was cocoa. Chocolate, like tobacco, soon became another rage in Europe. Tomatoes were a American plant and were imported to Europe and became a really important part of the European diets. Think of the Italians adding tomatoes to their pasta. Plants from America to Europe, left to right from the top row, were peppers, corn, pumpkins, peanuts, potatoes, vanilla, beans, pineapples, and squash. The full Columbian exchange of food took time, of course, but the Europeans quickly adopted much of the Native American diet. At the outset of colonization in Virginia, however, the Indians killed all the game in the nearby woods and threatened the colonists, causing the winter of 1609-1610 to become known as a starving time. There is some evidence that colonists resorted to cannibalism during the starving time, eating their dead colleagues. The early Puritan colonists in the North had it a bit easier at the outset, at least, with the Indians less hostile. The first Thanksgiving was celebrated with the Indians who had helped supply the colonists with food. It was part of the usual fall harvest celebration common in many cultures, where after harvesting a crop for the coming winter, a big celebration took place because they now knew they could survive the coming winter. Most notably, the colonists, like the Indians, found corn indispensable. It could be cooked and eaten on the cob or pounded into cornmeal with a simple mortar and pestle. They made corn mush with the use of milk, and it made a very high caloric food for them. Corn mush could be alternated with beans or meat if they had it, or baked into corn cakes. Very early in the colonial years, people even brewed corn whiskey. When coffee wasn't available, they used roasted and burnt corn as a substitute. Of course, as the years passed, all that became unnecessary. Throughout the 17th century, the 1600s, and well into the 18th century, the 1700s, most people in the northern colonies remained farmers. They were, however, largely small subsistence farmers. Given the environment, as time passed, cities grew and the number of artisans and merchants exploded. By the late colonial era, the northern colonies were no longer self-sufficient in food and were net importers of foodstuffs. As the northern colonies developed, increasingly people bought the food they needed at colonial markets. Over time in the South, where there was a longer growing season and more arable land, there were fewer cities and instead large estates or plantations developed. They grew what we call staple crops, crops used not for their own consumption, but rather for sale. While tobacco was the most obvious staple crop, rice imported from Africa and Asia, not the wild rice that had grown earlier in America, but rather the one from Africa and Asia, but it became a major staple crop. Rice required very hot, humid weather and very, very moist, and so was often grown in floodplains in the deep south. Of course, the colonists learned very quickly that they could grow these crops a little bit further to the west with the use of irrigation. Now, we talked about the colonies in the north and the colonies in the south. There's also the middle colonies, the mid-Atlantic colonies, and they were very prosperous in food production, most notably growing wheat, which obviously was made into flour, of course, as was barley, rye, and oats, also grown, among others. Throughout the colonial era, farmers had to deal with a fungus known as the wheat blast, which destroyed the crops, and you can see that here. They took the wheat and made it into flour at mills that were powered by water wheels. You put these by a flowing river, and the water would turn the wheel, and that'd create power to have a mortar crush the wheat into flour. Here you can see a colonial reenactor pouring it into the mill, and you can see the water wheel on the right. The total caloric intake of the colonists was much greater than Americans of later years, and many colonists performed hard physical labor daily. Bread was always a colonial favorite. Breakfast might consist of bread with butter or cheese. In the middle of the day, as part of their main meal, settlers might enjoy smoked or salted meat, or perhaps a bowl of stew with their bread. The evening meal was likely porridge, with bread of course. Fats and oils derived from animals were used to cook many colonial foods. Rendered pork fat, especially from bacon, was the most popular cooking medium. Meats were salted to preserve them and add taste. Colonial Americans drank a lot of alcohol, rum, brandy, and ale, although hard apple cider was especially a favorite. Whiskey wasn't particularly popular. In 1770, the average colonial Americans consumed about 3.5 gallons of alcohol per year, and that's about double the modern rate. Of course, they ate most of the meals cooking at home. There were, as the colonies grew, colonial taverns, and there you could get not only food but drink, and they would socialize and play darts and whatever. Here you see a colonial tavern, which is the center of their social life. Sugarcane and molasses grown in the Caribbean provided a key ingredient for colonial alcohol and other foods. That was why when the British taxed sugar before the Revolution, it really ticked off the colonists. Throughout the colonies, there remained, of course, regional variations. Because of the longer growing season and additional arable land, people in the South generally had a more varied diet. The cold seasons in the North restricted variety and mandated more imports. Fruits in the North not eaten in season were often preserved as jam, wet sweetmeats, or dried and cooked into pies that could be frozen during the winter months. People along the seacoast naturally relied more on fish and crustaceans. In general, as the colonies developed, Americans had a much better diet than the average European did at the same time. In any event, this concludes the first of the 3 videos on the American diet, this one focusing on the colonial era.